This is a concertina, a modern-day military field fortification. It can be assembled on the battlefield in several hours. The units are made of heavily galvanized wire mesh, lined with polypropylene geotextile and filled with any available material, from sand to rocks to snow. The concertina was first used in the Gulf War as a British field fortification. The densely packed walls are designed to withstand direct fire attack and offer blast protection from air-delivered bombs and large-caliber munitions. The concertina represents the culmination of an art that has evolved over thousands of years. It is the fortified castle of the new millennium.
You often hear people talking about impregnable fortresses. It's a myth. There is no such thing as an impregnable fortress. Any fortification can be taken if the attacker is willing to pay the cost. And that's a cost in lives, a cost in equipment, and a cost in time. The whole object of fortifications is to make that cost higher.
Fortifications are ubiquitous throughout every society in recorded history. The earliest ones were very simply designed hill forts. Prehistoric man would put a crude fence of branches or bits of wood around his animals to form a stockade. Usually these forts would be situated on a hill to make it more difficult for an intruder to arrive unnoticed. But while the walls were a deterrent, they were not strong enough to hold off any determined attacker.
Wooden stockades are fairly fragile structures. You can knock them down fairly easily. They rot. They catch fire. All sorts of bad things happen. So where it was available, people worked to start building walls out of stone.
Throughout history, many important events have taken place around a fortress. The first evidence of a city protected with stone walls was found in the Near East. The city of Jericho controlled that area because of its strategic location along the Jordan River. The original walls of this desert oasis are believed to date back to 8000 BC, built by a people known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. These people were masters of architecture. To keep the city safe from attack, the 3,000 inhabitants built freestanding large stone walls that were 6 feet thick and 23 feet high. There was a tower in one of the walls and a stairway. They also managed to dig a 10-foot deep ditch to surround the half-mile circumference. The walls of Jericho were rebuilt at least 19 times in the next 6,000 years because of damage by earthquake or war. The famed Bible story picks up at the beginning of the year 1300 BC, when the Israelites entered Palestine and sent Joshua to claim Jericho. For 6 days, Joshua walked around the perimeter of Jericho with trumpets blaring, and on the 7th day, as the saying goes, the walls came tumbling down. The construction of stone fortresses became more sophisticated throughout the ancient world, and so did the methods for breaching those walls.
They had battering rams. They had movable towers that they could move up against the walls of the forts to allow the attacker to get over the top of the walls. So again, we see this constant struggle between the defender and the attacker.
The city of Troy in Anatolia was strategically located, guarded the entrance to the Black Sea. The Greeks were unable to penetrate the walls, so in 1184 BC they devised another method to conquer the fortress.
The Greeks did not have very sophisticated siege equipment. They just had standard personal weapons, so all they could try and do was climb over the walls. And that's a hard thing to do against any well-built fortification that has a good garrison.
According to the Greek writer Homer in the Iliad, the city of Troy had steep 20-foot-high walls. It was believed to be impregnable. But the Greek general Ulysses hid his men in a huge wooden horse that was offered to the city as a gift. The gift was accepted, and the Greeks conquered Troy. As Ulysses proved, no fortress is absolutely impregnable. This was the cold reality that faced Herod, the king of Judea, in 35 BC. Herod was aligned with the Roman Empire, but he began to fear that Cleopatra coveted Masada, the gateway to Egypt and Africa. The name Masada comes from the Aramaic word mitzad, which means fortress. Herod was known as a master builder of his time, and Masada would be the jewel in his prestigious crown of personal strongholds. Masada's location, rising 1,300 feet above the Jordan River, made it seemingly unapproachable. But keeping a supply of food and water atop the fortress was a problem. So Herod built large, well-stocked storage houses and a series of cisterns which would gather the water from rain showers. During Herod's residence, no battles took place at Masada, but later, in the year 66 AD, a small group of Jewish zealots claimed Masada as their stronghold. It was the last bastion against the Roman army, who came back to conquer it in the year 72. The Romans built a camp below Masada and encircled the entire cliff fortress so no one could get out. The zealots, led by Alazar ben Yatir, took advantage of two natural rock ramps leading to the fortress to prepare for the attack.
They placed 100-pound rolling stones by each of these ramps or paths so that if anybody tried to climb up, they'd roll the stones down on them and they wouldn't be able to get up.
The Romans were determined to unseat the zealots from their stronghold. After 6 months of preparations, Flavius Silva led his men in an attack against the fortress.
And then he brought up what's known as a siege machine, which is a iron-plated wooden structure from within which archers could fire into Masada, the walled fortress. And while that was going on, the way that they covered themselves were with catapults, and hundreds of grapefruit-sized stones were found on the top of Masada.
The Romans started shooting flaming arrows, which ultimately set fire to the inner wooden walls of the fortress. This spelled doom for the 967 zealots on Masada.
Alazar ben Yair brought together the zealots and said, God has shown us that the tide is fatally turned against us. But we're not going to become slaves to the Romans. We got into this fight because we serve no one but God. Therefore, we will only allow our deaths to be by the hand of God. And what he meant by this was that they would commit suicide.
According to the Jewish historian Josephus, the men killed the women and children first, and then themselves. With the Israelites completely in their control, the Romans continued to expand and contain their empire through the use of precise, strong fortification techniques and sophisticated siege methods. Their status as a dominant world power would last for several hundred years. In the year 120 AD, the Emperor Hadrian ordered the building of a series of walls and forts to divide Roman Britain from the unconquered northern territory. It was built as much to keep the Britons in as to keep invaders out.
Hadrian's Wall is a quite sophisticated fortification. It's a stone wall. It's approximately 20 feet high, runs the entire width of Britain from the North Sea to the Irish Sea. There are, every mile, things called mile castles, which were small posts occupied by a full-time garrison. And between these were lookout towers, and then periodically spaced wider out were large fortified camps, all permanent fortifications built to last.
But Hadrian's Wall did not prove invincible in its day. It was besieged by attackers outside of Roman control, and this, coupled with weakened imperial authority in Rome, contributed to the end of the great Roman Empire.
Well, like every empire, every world power, they basically weakened over time for a variety of reasons. Corruption in the government, lack of energy, as it were, on the part of the population.
The fall of Rome in 400 AD brought about the Dark Ages. and the art of fortification all but disappeared.
They really went back to what was constructed back by primitive civilizations. Wooden stockades around towns, castles with wooden stockades around them. And gradually, those evolved into the castles of the Middle Ages.
In 1066, William of Normandy crossed the English Channel from France and quickly overtook Britain's defenses. To secure his position, he began building a chain of castles. These castles were populated by individual lords and barons who ruled their immediate surrounding territories. The number of Norman castles grew into the hundreds.
Typically, at that period, there was one nobleman who would attack another one. It was small actions, a very lawless period on the whole, very little central government.
Over the next 200 years, a more stable, centralized society developed, and the techniques of castle building and the purpose of the castle matured as well. In the British Isles, they became known as the bones of the kingdom, the king's fortresses.
During the Middle Ages, the castle evolved as the preeminent example of a defensive structure that could be used as a pivot in warfare.
The castles were constructed of quarried stone and bound with a mortar made of sand and lime. Hundreds of craftsmen worked on the structures. The elaborate designs included an outer curtain wall, which was maculated or indented with merlons, through which the defenders could fire their weapons and then duck for cover. The castles were equipped with protruding towers at the corners so that all sides of the curtain wall could be covered. And at certain points along the wall were meurtriers, or murder holes, through which the defenders could drop lethal objects like boiling oil upon the attackers if they succeeded in getting through the gate. In the 13th century, Edward I built many castles in Wales to protect England's interests there.
And you particularly begin to see that in the 12th and the 13th century. Castles become much more sophisticated, much more powerful. And you also see towns beginning to develop, and towns become more important. And because it's still not a very settled time, you needed fortifications to protect those towns. Of course, the classic example of that is Carcassonne in the south of France. It's a perfect example of a fortress or fortified town of the Middle Ages.
The world had become a walled fortress. The Great Wall of China, which was begun in 214 BC, covered 1,400 miles of mountainous terrain. The wall was 40 feet high in places and had 12-foot towers every 200 paces. Built to keep out foreign invaders, it was finally abandoned in 1368. In 324, Constantinople became the new Rome, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. This great walled city stood as the center of Middle Eastern civilization for more than 1,000 years, until it was conquered by the Turks in 1453. It was a new technological advance that signaled the downfall of the mighty fortress, the invention of gunpowder.
Essentially, gunpowder made the castle obsolete. It took a long time to reduce a castle by siege. When gunpowder came along, this was all changed. An adversary could put in place a cannon and knock down a wall in a matter of days rather than taking months.
Charles VIII of France introduced wheeled artillery that was made of a lighter weight and had higher muzzle velocity. Cannon fire posed a major problem for castle defenses. The greater the height of the walls, the better the target for the attack. Fiery missiles would crack the stone walls, weakening them to the point where they would eventually fall. Privately owned fortresses were soon to be a thing of the past, and the design and construction of fortifications became the sole domain of military engineers.
And the main approach that was taken was to lower the walls, to sink the walls into a ditch. By doing that, you put the outer edge of the ditch between you and the artillery. You cannot be hit directly. So you're much safer from gunpowder artillery. So that was the basic change that everyone made.
In the 1600s, Sébastien de Vauban was known as a master of siegecraft in the French army. He perfected a method of attack called sap and parallel. Attackers would dig trenches in a zigzag method up to the walls of a fortification to protect themselves and enable their cannons to hit their targets from a closer vantage point. During peacetime, Vauban was commissioned to improve existing French fortifications and design new, impregnable strongholds. In the course of his military career, Vauban worked on more than 160 fort constructions.
The fortresses built from scratch, built in open terrain, were basically star-shaped, and they could have anywhere from 7 or 8 bastions. And they were built symmetrically because you wanted every point of a fortification to be equally strong.
The Vaubannian star-shaped fortress, with its multiple vantage points, enabled the defenders of the fort to cover all angles of possible attack. Vauban died in 1707, but his style of fortifications based on geometric and scientific calculations would continue to be used throughout Europe and across the ocean in the New World. The Vaubannian star-shaped fortress that had worked so effectively in Europe migrated to North America with the Spanish and French settlers. This elaborate design was also used in 1755 in the construction of Fort Ticonderoga in the state of New York on Lake Champlain. Built by the French, it played a role in the French and Indian War and was taken by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution. The Americans held the fort until July of 1777, when General Burgoyne and his British Redcoats took it back. With Ticonderoga defeated, George Washington decided to fortify another strategic location, West Point. West Point presided over a vital section of the Hudson River, a highway for military movement at the time. If the British gained control of the Hudson, they would cut off a major supply source for the Continental Army.
It was essential to get men and material between the New England colonies and those to the mid-Atlantic colonies in the South. Whatever industrial capacity we had was in New England. The grain was in the West. It was essential that those two segments of the population could be brought to bear to defend the country.
West Point, New York is made up of rocky promontories on one side of the river and Constitution Island on the other. The river makes an S-shaped turn at this juncture, and that became another crucial reason for fortifying the area.
What this meant was that any British ship coming north would have to slow down considerably going through the S-turn. And the river also was narrow at this point, only 400 yards wide. That meant that the entire river could be covered with fire at a point where the British ships would be going the slowest.
The Continental Congress voted to fortify these highlands in 1775. The first man they chose to design the structures was a Dutch botanist named Bernard Romans.
The selection of Bernard Romans as the first engineer at West Point in some ways highlights the absence of trained professional officers. The Continental Congress did not have anyone to turn to entrust with this very large project, and were forced to turn to basically the first individual who said he could do it.
Romans' plan for West Point became a costly and ill-fated endeavor.
And because he had no military experience, he didn't understand the difference between simple principles such as grazing fire and plunging fire, and emplaced his cannons high up on the hill, where they would actually have a very hard time aiming down and shooting at the British warships.
Romans' batteries were abandoned in October 1777. But General Washington did not give up on his plan to fortify West Point. He needed land protection for the great chain that he installed across the Hudson. The chain was strong enough to hold the British vessels back as they made their way up the river.
There were 500 links of the chain. Each one of those links weighs about 120 pounds. The total weight of the entire contraption of those links of the chains, as well as clevises and other stabilizing devices, is estimated to have weighed in excess of 150 tons. And you can imagine when you're just dealing with oxen and horses and men, what kind of job that was.
In early 1778, Washington brought Thaddeus Kosciuszko, Polish military engineer, to West Point to begin a second phase of fortifications. He looked at the rocky lay of the land and came up with the idea of building field fortifications in key locations and mini-forts called redoubts along the river. This became Fortress West Point.
A Fortress West Point consists of several forts, a number of redoubts on both sides of the river, and taking advantage of the difference in elevations. Kosciuszko was a master in utilizing the differences in terrain.
Washington felt confident that the fortress at West Point would buy him time in the Hudson River area. But what he didn't count on was that his commandant would try to betray him.
The closest that the British came to taking Fortress West Point was during the commandantship of Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold was becoming disillusioned with the revolution and saw no way to achieve absolute victory. At West Point, he began making plans to provide the British with military secrets. He passed the information to John Andre, a British go-between.
He began to let the fort and redoubts begin to decay, not keeping them up so it would make it easier for the British to attack. And if he had been successful, if the plans had gotten to the British, there's no doubt with a traitor in command of West Point, the British could have been successful.
But the British never did get the plans. Major Andre was apprehended before delivery, and Benedict Arnold was accused of treason. West Point was never attacked by the British, due in part to the new interdependent system of forts devised by Thaddeus Kosciuszko.
This may have been simply an ad hoc series of solutions to a series of problems and not a grandiose scheme to actually come up with a revolutionary new system of fortifications. This is reinforced by the fact that after the American Revolution, you see a decline in the use of a series of fortifications and the return to the idea of one main fortification, which would lead to the building of Fort McHenry.
Fort McHenry was a coastal fort built to defend the city of Baltimore against a British sea attack during the War of 1812. It was here that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. The United States continued to fortify the eastern seaboard, and in 1829 construction began on another coastal stronghold on Cockspur Island in Savannah, Georgia. Like Fort McHenry, the purpose of Fort Pulaski was to defend the port of Savannah against foreign invaders. One of the original engineers on the project was a recent West Point graduate named Robert E. Lee.
It was in this environment, because of its strategic location in the middle of the Savannah River, that Lee and the administration of President Madison decided that they should build a fort here that could best protect the port city of Savannah, protecting not only the city, but of course all the commerce, the rice that was cultivated along the coastal areas, the cotton, the pitch, the tar, the pine. All these things were very important commodities.
Because of Cockspur Island's marshy grasslands, Fort Pulaski had to have a special foundation to support its enormous weight.
It sits on pilings that go 81 feet into the ground, and on top of the pilings are what's called grillage. Grillage is nothing more than a fancy word for a large platform. And on that platform, on those pilings, sit this fort.
Fort Pulaski is pentagonal shaped. Its walls are 7.5 feet thick, constructed out of 25 million bricks that were made by local slaves. The fort took 18 years to build. An entire town of workers grew up around the construction site. When it was finished in 1847, U.S. Chief Engineer Joseph G. Totten declared that it was as invincible and strong as the Rocky Mountains. 15 years later, Tott's statement would be put to the test. In December of 1860, federal troops took over Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, and the war between the states began. In January of 1861, the Confederate States of America seized Fort Pulaski and began arming it for battle. In the meantime, the Union Army, led by Engineer Captain Quincy A. Gilmore, was building a series of field fortifications and artillery batteries on Tybee Island, a mile away across the Savannah River. By April of 1862, they had painstakingly constructed 11 artillery batteries containing 36 cannons and mortars, all aimed directly at Fort Pulaski. Gilmore decided to try out a new type of unproven rifled artillery for the assault, and that proved to be the death knell for Fort Pulaski.
Well, the point in history or the technology is a new type of cannon that would make this fort and all others all over the world obsolete.
On April 10th, 1862, Gilmore launched his assault. Soldiers on both sides were surprised by the performance of this new rifled cannonball. It could hit targets precisely over a mile away. The ribs in the projectile allowed the blast to propel it on a faster, longer, and more direct trajectory. The Union fired over 5,000 shots in about 30 hours before Colonel Charles Olmsted surrendered. The precision of the cannon fire had succeeded in breaching 2 walls of Fort Pulaski and damaged the door to the powder magazine, where 40,000 pounds of gunpowder was stored.
When Olmsted found the magazine filling with smoke, he knew that the thing to do would be to surrender, because it would have just been a matter of time before the magazine would have detonated. That much powder going off, the concussion probably would have killed most of the men in here without ever having a chance to try to defend themselves.
After only 30 hours, Colonel Olmsted surrendered Fort Pulaski.
After the battle was over, only 14 people were injured in the fort. 1 would die at the time and 1 apparently later on. Over on Tybee, there was not one single person wounded and only 1 man killed. So for a Civil War battle, it was relatively bloodless.
The effect of the new rifled artillery would change military engineering forever. In the early 1800s, while the United States government was building up its coastal forts on the Atlantic seaboard, the settling of the Western Territory was also gaining momentum. In the wilderness of Wyoming, beaver trappers and fur traders were playing a crucial role in this expansion. The first fort in the area was established as a meeting place for Indians, trappers, and those who wanted to purchase the pelts. It was situated on the Laramie River, near its confluence with the Platte.
The fort was built throughout the summer of 1834. And it was a classic log palisade fort. Walls were maybe 15, 16 feet high. It may have been around 100 feet square. It had blockhouses on its corners and above its main gate. An image of it was painted in 1837 by a traveling artist named Alfred Jacob Miller. And ever since, it has become the quintessential image of a Western frontier fort.
When the beaver fur trade became depressed, the entrepreneurs turned to buffalo. The Indians were happy to trade their abundant hides for the goods available at the fort.
The primary purpose of the trader fort's walls was to prevent theft. They were loaded with highly valuable trade goods: guns, knives, axes, blankets, cloth, cooking pots, all kinds of things that to the Plains tribes were enormous sources of wealth.
The buffalo hide business proved to be promising, and in 1836 the American Fur Company bought the fort and replaced the wooden walls with adobe.
And it was a very, very big business. And like business today, image is very important. Image is prestige. And the forts that the fur traders built often were built not necessarily for defense, but to reflect the prestige and power of the company. And by the 1830s, the American Fur Company had become America's richest corporation.
In the 1840s, the number of emigrants to the West began to increase. In 1849, the United States government purchased the fort and made it a military outpost to protect the pioneers along the Oregon Trail.
They were going to California to get rich. They were going to Oregon to find farmland. They were going to Utah for religious freedom. They weren't planning to stay out here on the plains. And so the Army's role was not to help settle these plains, but merely to facilitate travel and communication and keep the Indians at bay for the duration of that mission.
In 1851, Fort Laramie played host to the Indian leader Red Cloud and a tribal treaty council to promote peace within the warring Indian factions. The Army never rebuilt the decaying adobe walls around Fort Laramie, as they did not feel a direct threat from the Indians.
Well, having Indians besiege a fort is something that we see a lot in the movies, but it seldom happened in reality. Plains Indians usually tried to avoid the Army and its forts as much as possible.
But there was one incident when a small group of soldiers came back from patrol and allowed their horses a much-needed rest on the open area in the middle of the fort.
So the cavalry horses, about 30 head, had just no sooner been unsaddled and were turned loose on the parade ground when a Sioux war party swept through the post, scooped up the horses, went right out the other side, and disappeared. That's bravery, and one has to admire the audacity of an act like that.
Life at the fort was relatively comfortable. Most of the soldiers belonged to cavalry and infantry units, and at its peak, there were over 700 troops stationed at the post. The fort had communal barracks for the enlisted men, and the officers had separate quarters. Fort Laramie still acted as a trading post and was a major station for the Pony Express in 1860.
The Pony Express didn't last long. It lasted only a very short time because it was supplanted then by another even more effective means of communication, the transcontinental telegraph.
By the late 1850s, over 50,000 immigrants visited Fort Laramie each year. Many of those visitors were prominent people of their time.
One of them was Mark Twain, and another was Wyatt Earp. Great Indian chiefs, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Spotted Tail, great Army generals, and a lot of people that we've never heard of course. Nameless, faceless people that made up the real story of American westward expansion.
When the mass emigration west slowed down in the 1870s, Fort Laramie no longer served a vital purpose.
General Sherman had expressed his desire as early as 1880, 1882, that the Army should consolidate its forts and abandon those that were not found necessary.
Fort Laramie officially closed in 1890.
It was born of the frontier. It made that frontier happen. When the frontier closed, so did Fort Laramie.
Less than 30 years later, in the early 1900s, the United States Armed Forces turned their attention to the Great War in Europe. There were no fixed fortifications. Soldiers on the front lines launched offensives from trenches and underground bunkers. This new aggressive form of warfare proved devastating, especially to the French. they lost over 1 million men in the Great War, and over 4 million more were wounded or taken prisoner. In 1920, André Maginot, the French Minister of War, secured financing for a great wall of France to discourage further attack by Germany. It lined the border between France and Germany and stretched from the Rhine River all the way to Luxembourg. Maginot's plan was an ultra-modern defensive system for its time, because except for the gun turrets, the majority of the forts were built underground, sometimes as deep as 100 feet to protect the troops from return fire bombardment. The 58 large forts and 400 smaller ones were connected by tunnels that hauled equipment and ammunition between the blocks. Each fort had 10-foot thick walls made of reinforced concrete. Here, over 1,000 men would eat, sleep, train, and wait months for a confrontation that never came. They even had a special system of air filtering.
The air inside these blocks and inside the entire Maginot Line forts was kept at a higher pressure than the outside, and any air that was taken into the forts was filtered. The object was to keep any poison gas out, because poison gas had been such a major issue during the First World War.
Despite the supposed impregnable nature of these fortifications, they were never really tested. In 1940, Hitler simply chose to ignore the Great Wall and attack the Ardennes in Belgium to completely surround the French army in Alsace. Less than 1 month later, the proud fortress soldiers marched into captivity.
The Maginot Line, in some respects, did its job. The Germans did not come through it in any significant way. They went round it. Unfortunately, the French weren't very well prepared for this, and we all know what happened. But the actual forts of the Maginot Line held out fairly well.
The Maginot Line dissuaded the Germans from attacking France's eastern frontier, and it gave the French army time to fully mobilize and deploy. But its legacy was the lesson that modern wars were mobile affairs, battles that were won or lost by the strength of artillery, or tanks, or aircraft power. The failure of the Maginot Line caused General Patton to comment, "Permanent fortification is a monument to man's stupidity." After World War II, the threat of nuclear annihilation haunted the minds of military engineers and defense strategists around the world. Permanent fortifications were no longer viable, considering the power of a detonated missile. Early detection and quick response time became the goal. In 1966, the North American Air Defense Command Center opened its 30,000-pound doors. It was built under 2,000 feet of granite in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. A fort for the nuclear age. NORAD is basically an electronic sentinel for Allied forces around the world. It was here that the Scud missiles launched by Iraq were identified, and anti-ballistic missiles were alerted to respond.
Reported a launch and impact of a missile out of southern Iraq.
Predicted impact in Saudi Arabia.
1,400 men and women work in this 4.5-acre complex that is a maze of chambers and tunnels. The center itself is crafted to withstand a medium-range nuclear blast, and its inhabitants would be able to survive for up to 30 days in that event. At the same time that NORAD was being built, Air Force and aerospace engineers were developing a smaller nuclear missile that would be lighter in weight, easier to launch, but still be effective.
Those two technologies merged, the capability to develop a strategic weapon to be able to project a deterrent force over 5,000 miles distance without any personnel with the weapon became a very useful tool in a strategic perspective.
Since the 1960s, these intercontinental ballistic missile launch systems have been fashioned into mini fortresses themselves. They've been housed underground at complexes like the Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, California.
A system that is self-sustainable. It is a defensive system on its own. It has its own crew quarters for its personnel and has its own power generation capability, its own atmospheric controls, and it is housing a weapon system that, if used, is a very strategic weapon.
The Minuteman, Titan II, and Peacekeeper missiles weigh approximately 165 tons. The silos where they are kept are roughly 12 stories underground.
The door that covers that silo weighs 748 tons, and that door opens in 19 seconds. Now, that facility is connected to a launch control center, and the launch control center would be a 3-story structure underground. Should an explosive device be detonated near the facility, everything required to operate the weapon system is hanging on shock isolation systems, or coil springs in the case of the Titan II program. The facility is designed to be able to withstand, essentially, any attack that would be thrown against it. So as the aggressor comes to try and take the control of the silo, be it through an attack via strategic missile versus strategic missile, the system is designed to be able to withstand the effects of those attacks.
If deployed, the missiles travel at a speed of up to 17,000 miles per hour. They have a pinpoint accuracy of roughly 100 meters.
It's like throwing a baseball. The accuracy of the baseball toss is dependent on the speed and angle at which you release the ball.
The missile silo is to some the heir apparent to the age-old notion of the impregnable fortress.
The original fortress was designed to protect its contents, be that an operational or defensive position or asset. The ICBM is, in a sense, both. It has its own defensive posture. It is an offensive device, but it is defensive in the nature that it is a deterrent system.
Systems of defense and attack have evolved throughout history. But while the tactics have changed, the principles are the same. The forts of today may or may not become tourist attractions when they're left behind. Perhaps they will be named after heroic generals. But they are efficient and effective, a threat and a deterrent. And that is the point of any fortification.